All right. So we've got Alan Brinkley, The Unfinished Nation, chapter 20. Chapter 20 is the chapter on the progressives. And kind of a good way to understand the progressives, or sometimes referred to as the progressive movement, is to think about something we've talked in the earlier chapters. That was the Gilded Age. The progressive movement, in a lot of ways, comes after the Gilded Age. So, thematically, chronologically, the progressive movement is after the Gilded Age. But the Gilded Age brought a new set of problems in American society. And we discussed some of the ways in which people tried to find solutions for those problems, but most of them were inadequate. In a lot of ways, what the progressive movement is about is solutions to those problems, right? Solutions to Gilded Age problems, right? More broadly speaking. Um, the progressive movement or progressivism isn't like a very, very specific definition. It is generally a belief in solving a variety of issues. And so there are a lot of people that can fall under the progressive umbrella. There are people who could be progressive on some issues, but not considered progressives on others. Broadly speaking, if we think about the Gilded Age, kind of the types of ideas that influenced the Gilded Age the most, this is kind of what the progressives are after. So, for example, notions like laissez-faire or hands-off the economy, ideas like social Darwinism, the idea that, society is like nature and you shouldn't intervene. The progressives are really targeting these ideas. They disagree with the notion of laissez-faire, hands-off free market capitalism. They disagree with the notion of social Darwinism, that society should be just kind of left to its own devices. And they want to fundamentally intervene and play some sort of role in society to make it better. We can just list a couple of progressive beliefs if we want to make this a little bit more specific. So, for the first example, we might say that concentrated power is bad. And, we might think specifically here the problem of monopoly, specifically concentrated economic power is a bad thing. And so progressives are going to look to dismantle that. A second thing is that general welfare is good. In other words, kind of under social Darwinism, the idea is that there are some people who are fit, some people are unfit. You shouldn't mess around with society to allow those that are the fittest to rise to the top. In some ways, under the idea of social Darwinism, um, distinctions between the rich and poor are not only tolerable but even desired. The progressives believe that if everybody is better off, that is beneficial for everyone. So there needs to be a concern about the general welfare of broadly entire societies. A third aspect of progressive beliefs is a belief in knowledge, or we might say, science. Progressives believe that by applying knowledge, by applying science, society could be made better. And the fourth belief that we'll list for the progressive movement is that the government must participate. And these are kind of linked together. So, kind of broadly talking about all of these things that progressives believe, we can kind of connect the dots to say, knowledge and science will inform progressive beliefs and progressive policies in which the government will play a role to promote general welfare and challenge the concentrated economic power. So, broadly speaking, those are the types of things that progressives want to address. Now, before they can start addressing these issues, there needs to be some sort of, push or priority to make these issues more known to the general public. Um, or, a lot of the problems from Gilded Age society were not known to those who were in political power. And so it was up to individuals, sometimes referred to as muckrakers, to expose the problems of Gilded Age society to the broader, we might call them the class that has, state power. So muckrakers, we'll just say that they are people who expose the problems in society. And once society is aware of those problems, then action can be taken to redress those problems. A great example is the muckraker Ida Tarbell, who exposed the corrupt and immoral practices of John Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. And in fact, by the early 1900s, Standard Oil was, in fact, broken up into much smaller companies. And so challenging at least the Standard Oil Company, Rockefeller, who really is the personification of the American robber baron, he probably more than anyone else represents monopolistic power. It was in part due to people like Tarbell, who exposed the kind of cutthroat practices, immoral actions, and behaviors that helped bring that company down. Muckrakers, more broadly speaking, were interested in social justice. That is not necessarily justice for individual people, but rather justice for society. Especially those who do not have access to the levers of power. Many of those involved in the progressive movement don't come from the underclasses of society themselves, but do seek justice for them. Now, there were a lot of different elements to the progressive movement. We sort of outlined some of the broad belief systems, but there were groups that had maybe like 1 foot in the progressive camp, but then 1 foot out of it. And a great example of this is the social gospel movement. The social gospel movement had the same goal that the progressives did. So we might say that this movement sought to improve society. But instead, the social gospel wanted to utilize Christianity. Certainly one way in which Gilded Age cities were characterized were immoral, corrupt, full of sin. And so for those that were more involved in kind of the religious tradition or the Christian background, they believed that infusing Christianity into urban society could help solve some of these problems. A famous saying that sprouted from the social gospel movement, which you may or may not have come into contact before, is WWJD, and that stands for What Would Jesus Do? And members of the social gospel movement would, ask or at least, bring up this idea that when tempted to sin, think to yourself, what would Jesus do in this particular circumstance? So we can see that movements like the gospel, although they have some of the same goals as the progressives did, and they could agree with progressives on some particular or certain issues, there were others that perhaps they were not on board with, for example. But there are some crossovers with other groups. Now, in addition to making people aware of the ills of society, the muckrakers, and in fact, this was a term that was coined by the president Teddy Roosevelt. The idea was that these people raked through the muck of society. That gives you an idea of what they thought about Gilded Age society at the time, that it was muck. That was one way of doing it. Another way of doing it was having a much more hands-on approach. Probably the best example of this was the progressive reformer Jane Addams, who had established a settlement house or settlement houses in the United States, most notably Hull House. And this was part of a broader movement to assist the urban poor. So, a settlement house, more broadly speaking, we'll call it an institution. It's more or less a building set up to assist the urban poor. We might also add immigrant groups as well, right, in particular. And so settlement houses, they were first originated in England and they were brought to the United States. Jane Addams established the Hull House Settlement House, which was in Chicago. At the time, Chicago, I think probably more than any other city, had the largest percentage of people there born outside of the United States. And the idea behind the settlement houses was that they could provide a number of different services. Settlement houses could be daycares. They could be schools to learn languages, to learn the English language, to learn a job skill. They could be an orphanage, if one was unable to take care of a child. They could just provide general shelter. So they served multiple functions in assisting people. And we might say that, whereas on the one hand, people like Tarbell, Jacob Riis, we talked about in the previous chapter, these were muckrakers who exposed the problems of society. Those that were involved in the settlement house movement, they actually went into the most vulnerable parts of American society, the poorest, the most dangerous, the most urban, and really made a practical change right there on the ground. We want to know Jane Addams as being the person who established Hull House. And she was maybe the most, one of the most famous progressive reformers of the time, right? Of the time. She was somebody that was born to a middle-class background, never married, never had children, and instead dedicated her life to this settlement house movement. And this kind of brings us to, again, maybe one of the more well-known aspects of the progressive movement, and that is the role that women played and eventually the push for women's suffrage. So it's very important to understand that for a very long time, women played a role in American society and in the public arena more broadly through various reform movements. And that is, we might say that women unable to vote or hold office did shape, we'll say, public policy through reform. And you could go back before the Civil War period and find various examples of reform movements that not only included women, but women were the majority and the central driving force. Movements against the consumption of alcohol, movements against prostitution, movements against immigration, movements for the abolition of slavery. So despite the fact that women were barred from voting and barred from holding office, that's not to say that they didn't have a public role. Now, during the Gilded Age, because more and more people were moving to the cities, including women, there was a growing demographic of quote-unquote new women, or sometimes referred to as the new woman. And these were women who were, we'll call them urban residents, and more likely to be either single or divorced. They were less likely to adhere to the kind of traditional norms that had characterized American society up until that point. Um, More likely to be sexually promiscuous, for example, more likely to engage in kind of non-traditional relationships, women and women relationships, lesbian relationships. And many of them who were not had the same um, ties to things like spouses and children were able to participate more in the public and more in kind of social and political movements. And so even before there was even before the push or the culmination of women's suffrage, there were various sorts of clubs and organizations that were established across the United States to advocate for various causes. The club women, as they called them, so these would be women involved in public issues. And amongst the public issues, there were a number of them, but during the Gilded Age, I would say probably one of the biggest issues that needed to be addressed was the issue of child labor. Child labor was on the rise during the Gilded Age, and certainly after the Gilded Age was over, that was, in some ways, issue number one that needed to be addressed. A lot more of this kind of public activity led to a greater push for women's suffrage. Now, women's suffrage was something that had already existed prior to the Civil War. Typically, we kind of set the starting point of the women's suffrage movement in the United States to 1848 in Seneca Falls, when women from all sorts of different reform backgrounds came together and drafted a Declaration of Sentiments, which was very much similar to the Declaration of Independence, which stated that women's equality would come in the form of suffrage or the right to vote. That's what suffrage means if you're not familiar with that term. Suffrage simply means the right to vote. And so this movement to try and win the right to vote had been going on in the United States, at least formally, since 1848. And in fact, if we kind of recall something that we talked about in the previous chapters, that the ratification of the 15th Amendment, right, this is good review. The 15th Amendment, which was universal male suffrage, or more specifically, the right for Black men to vote in the United States, when that was passed, it kind of created a resurgence in this debate over women's suffrage, some supporting the 15th Amendment, some opposing it. Maybe the most significant thing in getting the 19th Amendment passed is actually something covered in the, not this chapter, but a future chapter, and that was the role that women played in World War I. So please do keep that in mind. World War I was a total war which required the participation of all men and women, and a large part due to women's contributions in the war, that gave them a position to make a much stronger argument for their participation in the politics. If they could participate in the economy and the war, then why would they be barred from from the political process? However, though, in tying something back to the Gilded Age, one thing that women's suffrage advocates really tactically used well was this cultural notion of separate spheres. And separate spheres was something that characterized really urban, northern, middle class American society, consumer society, since before the Civil War. The notion of separate spheres was the idea that in terms of American society, men play a role in the public sphere and women play a role in the domestic sphere. That women and men should occupy completely separate spheres within the broader American society. But given the Gilded Age, the public sphere had become in a lot of ways corrupt. There was a lot of corruption, not just in the form of political corruption during the Gilded Age, but in the form of the rise of crime, the rise of sin, the problems of poverty. And, you know, again, traditionally, the notion of the domestic sphere was that this was kind of a pure sphere, innocent, not corrupt. And so, one way that women advocated and pushed for the right to vote was not necessarily to challenge these stereotypes, but to actually use the stereotype of separate spheres in order to gain the right to vote. And that was the argument that women who were the in charge of everything pure, everything uncorrupt, that to have a positive role on cleansing the broader corrupt American society ought to have a role in public office and ought to have a role in voting. So it was by using the stereotype to make the argument that women as inhabiting the uncorrupt sort of sphere of American society could have a positive and purifying influence on everything that was already corrupt. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed to the Constitution, which granted federal women's suffrage. Right, in 1920, women's suffrage passed on a national level. That is the 19th Amendment. And so women's suffrage plays into kind of a larger goal of the progressive movement, and that was the goal to reform government. Remember, the progressives believed that government needed to be used in order to make society better. However, during the Gilded Age, government was corrupt. And in some senses, the very first effort by progressives was to cleanse the government of its corrupt elements. And the way that you could do that was by expanding democracy. And of course, the greatest expansion of democracy, maybe ever in American history, is, or at least maybe even in world history, was the 19th Amendment. Whereas now you're allowing for 50% of the population who couldn't vote before. In fact, the majority of the population in many cases are now able to vote. And so progressives will further look to expand democracy beyond the 19th Amendment in order to get rid of the corrupt aspects of government. Once the government is cleansed of its corruption, then it can do good, right? And that is the idea. And so we're going to have several different types of political reforms that help get some of the more corrupt elements of the government out so the government can do good on behalf of the people. So just like the chapter on Reconstruction, there are several amendments that we should be familiar with. The 19th Amendment we already know as being the amendment in regards to women's suffrage. The next amendment we're going to outline here is the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment allows for the direct election of U.S. senators. Before and in the Constitution, United States senators were chosen by state legislatures. Of course, state legislatures were elected upon, but the senators themselves were never chosen directly by the people. Now, with the 17th Amendment in effect, people have more democratic power in order to choose exactly who represents them in the Senate. So this was a way of expanding the democratic process. Two kind of laws or policies here that are designed to bypass the corrupt state legislatures, right? Again, when we think about our political system, it's not necessarily the people that create the laws, but it's the elected officials. And if those elected officials are not passing laws that are directly responsive to the people, then not a lot gets, not really a lot changes. And that's kind of what these problems are looking to fix. So the initiative lets people create laws by popular vote. And the referendum, which is very much similar, lets people, we might say, approve or strike down laws by popular vote. And again, both of these things together, the purpose of both of these laws is to bypass corrupt, mostly state, because these are on a state level, legislatures. If you think about it, once you elect somebody into office, again, they make all these promises about what they're going to do. And then once they get elected into office, there's very little accountability for them until the next election cycle comes up. And so let's say there's a problem that needs to be addressed immediately. It's so clearly obvious that, if it were left up to a popular vote, people would address it immediately. But because the state legislature is, corrupt or incompetent or unable to do anything, both of these things are ways in which people have greater control over the laws, right? Greater control over the laws. Two other ones include the recall. The recall is a popular vote to allow the removal of an elected official. Again, think like a governor or something like that. If he ends up being so bad, the recall actually gives people the power to remove him. This was new in a lot of states. And the direct primary, if you're not familiar, the primary is the process by which each political party chooses their candidate. The direct primary is, again, a popular vote to choose the candidate. So one of the things that all of these things have in common, initiative, referendum, recall, direct primary, popular vote, popular vote, popular vote, and popular vote. These are all ways of expanding democracy to give people more control over the government. And we could even add this for the 17th Amendment, right, by popular vote. Now, amongst those that were maybe the most visible progressives was Robert La Follette, aka they called him Fighting Bob. And Fighting Bob was from the state of Wisconsin, which was nicknamed the laboratory of the progressive movement. He was governor and senator. And so, in a lot of ways, Wisconsin became somewhat, we'll call this quote unquote, the lab of progressivism. I will just say Robert La Follette, governor and senator of Wisconsin. Wisconsin, in some ways, was because we also have to remember a lot of these laws and policies are kind of new. They haven't been tried before, they're experimental. And so Wisconsin was kind of a place where the rest of the nation looked upon to see if these progressive changes were doing good, right? It was this experiment of some sorts. Just some examples of what Wisconsin did on a state level. They regulated railroads, as best as they could. They provided workers with insurance if they got hurt on the job, again, protection for workers, and a graduated income tax. And this was something that was advocated for all the way, all the way back to the populist movement, facing a tax system on how much money you earned. Robert La Follette would eventually make a run for the White House, but he would never be able to, sort of capture that position anyways. But he was known nationally, and maybe before Theodore Roosevelt, or even with Theodore Roosevelt, was known as one of the leading progressive politicians. So, when we think about the progressive movement more broadly speaking, a lot of the issues that they want to address impact the kind of less privileged classes of society. But broadly speaking, most of the progressive movement actually comes from the middle class. That is, they're relatively well off. It includes men and women. Women, especially, were active in the progressive movement. Also, many of them were Protestant Christian, which at sometimes could put them at odds with other religious groups or religious denominations. This was a group that, um, had more access to, for example, political and economic power. And we should also mention that most of them are white or Anglo in background. Um, and so, certain groups like immigrant groups, like workers groups, in some ways they line up very closely with the progressives. So, for example, immigrants and workers will certainly be on the same page when it comes to like protections for workers' insurance, higher pay, right? Those are things they can agree with. But then on some of the cultural issues, they may not agree with. A lot of those immigrants coming to the United States are not Protestant, they're Catholic and Jewish. Many people of the working class do want to engage in what progressives, reformers would consider to be immoral, right? Alcohol consumption, for example, or prostitution, stuff like that. So, um, the main source of the progressive movement is kind of coming from this demographic, but they can find allies in other demographics depending on what particular issues that they talk about. Now, probably one of the more public examples in which the progressive movement gained national attention was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which happened in 1911. And this was a workplace accident, or accident may be too generous here, but this was a fire that resulted, oops, that resulted in the deaths of 146 workers. And most of these workers were very young women. This was not the deadliest workplace accident in American history, but maybe the most public just because of the way, or publicized, just because of the situation surrounding it. The Triangle Shirtwaist factory was located on the top of a skyscraper, and the managers there would lock the doors so that the workers inside couldn't take a break when it wasn't time for them to take a break. Many of the workers were young immigrant women, anywhere between the ages of, 13 and 20 or something like that. And so when the factory caught on fire, there were really well, first of all the doors were locked, so many of them couldn't escape. But there were no safety precautions that were in place. The firefighters didn't have ladders tall enough, they didn't have hoses powerful enough. The fire escapes simply just melted. And the images that the public were faced with, given no way to escape, many of these young women jumped from the 10-story building to their deaths in a very crowded and public area of New York. And so it was the visuals of young women jumping to their deaths in a very public area that really shocked the entire country. And in the aftermath of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the progressive movement had a lot more allies in terms of trying to find, workplace, safety, reforms for um, making buildings and working areas safer. Um, so for everything that the progressives wanted to address, or did address, I should say, there were certainly some blind spots to the progressive movement. Probably none bigger than the issues that were being faced by African Americans in particular within the United States. The progressives did not do really much of anything to address the problems of Jim Crow segregation, and just the broader impacts of racial discrimination in American society. That's not to say that there weren't any voices seeking to reform the United States when it came to racial issues. In fact, there were several reformers and organizations that spoke up about the injustices that Black Americans faced in the post Civil War era following the conclusion of Reconstruction. Early on, probably one of the more famous reformers was Booker T. Washington, who himself had been born into slavery. And Booker T. Washington advocated a type of kind of self improvement of sorts. We might say, advocated for economic and educational, we'll say self improvement. That is, that in order for African Americans to achieve equality in the United States, they should become educated and work hard and accumulate resources, land, money, and through their economic and educational advancement, things like political rights would come later. Booker T. Washington would establish the Tuskegee, I don't know if I'm spelling that right, Institute, which would be a college, an all-black college, to learn the various skills that were required for economic improvement. Other reformers disagreed with Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois was probably one of the more important voices when it came to the experience of African Americans in the United States, and didn't agree with Washington. Here's Washington here. Here is W.E.B. Du Bois here. Du Bois, unlike Washington, was born in the North, and he was very highly educated. He was the first Black man to earn a PhD from Harvard University. And Du Bois said that it was crucial for African Americans to fight for social and political equality. That as long as the laws discriminated against Black Americans, that all of the economic and other types of self-improvement didn't really mean too much. W.E.B. Du Bois writes on a wide variety of issues relating to the African American experience in the United States, what the situation's like, what could be done about it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as his disagreement with Washington goes, W.E.B. was much more focused on social, legal, and political equality, that fight for rights. He helped to create what would become the premier civil rights organization in the United States, and that is the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which I want to say, I don't know exactly the date, but something like 1903. It was established very, very early on, not too long after, Reconstruction. And the NAACP would be primarily focused on issues relating to Jim Crow and racial discrimination. For a very long time, the cause of civil rights advocates in the United States, and again, by civil rights, think about, when you hear civil, think about civilians. So that's the rights of civilians. In terms of civil rights, one of the chief kind of issues that people like Du Bois and especially Ida B. Wells focused on was the problem of lynching or the epidemic of lynching. Lynching was the practice of mob justice, which targeted black men in the South, primarily in the South, but you could have lynchings in the North. Mob justice, which targeted black men in the South and held public executions. See, when Reconstruction ended, right, we talked about the compromise in a previous chapter, compromise of 1877. When Reconstruction ended, Union troops left the South. And so Union troops were no longer there to uphold 13, 14, and 15. Union troops were no longer there to protect the rights that that African Americans enjoyed during Reconstruction. And so many of the local authorities, state authorities, were unwilling to persecute those mobs of people who targeted typically black men accused of some sort of sexual misconduct or sexual crime against white women. And they would kill them publicly, and nobody would be held accountable. And so this was an issue that, especially Ida B. Wells, she is probably the most known for advocating for a federal response to lynchings. And, for civil rights advocates in the post-Reconstruction period, lynching was one of those central, central issues. There's somewhat of a misconception in American history that, after the Civil War ended, everything was kind of good. And then Martin Luther King Jr. came along and suddenly the civil rights movement was born. And that's not entirely accurate. In fact, immediately following Reconstruction, there were already people talking about issues related or issues that African Americans faced in particular, starting with Washington right, during and through Reconstruction, later on with W.E.B. Du Bois, the National Association being established very early on as well, and an effort to try and get a federal law against lynching almost from the very beginning. So civil rights didn't just appear with Martin Luther King Jr., it was only in the 1960s with Martin Luther King that a breakthrough was made on that front. So do be aware of the ongoing efforts to address issues pertaining to civil rights. And again, that was something that was largely ignored by the progressive movement more broadly. So whereas the progressives did a lot to expand democracy, cleanse politics from its corrupt elements, there were also some areas in which progressive reforms started to experience maybe some pushback. This kind of brings us up or brings up a good question, and that is, what are the limits of progressive reform? How far can those people go to try and make society better? And, in hindsight, anyways, we can at least, kind of target a couple of areas. The first one is in the temperance movement, right? Temperance is the movement to ban alcohol. And if we're thinking of it, from the kind of progressive side, if we're looking at it from sort of the progressive perspective, and we just ask ourselves, alcohol, missing an O. If we look at it just from the progressive perspective and ask ourselves, would society be better if there was no alcohol? And, the answer to that question very well could be yes. Um, this movement to ban alcohol for the betterment of society had predated the Civil War. Um, and there were kind of fights going on at the local level between what were referred to as sometimes wet counties and dry counties. A wet county was a county that allowed alcohol, a dry county was a county that did not allow alcohol. And in fact, by the time of the 18th Amendment, which does enact a federal prohibition of alcohol, so the 18th Amendment is a federal prohibition of alcohol. By the time that the 18th Amendment is passed, alcohol is already banned in half of the country, anyways, just through the various local elections between the wets and the dries. Um, Several organizations help make this possible, including the WCTU, which stands for the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And specifically, if we want to think about prohibition, it is the prohibiting of the selling, manufacturing, and transport of alcohol. Of alcohol. And the reason why I mention prohibition as perhaps maybe one of the limits of it is because the federal prohibition on alcohol actually had some pretty significant side effects. Most notably, it led to the rise of organized crime. And eventually, the 18th Amendment would be repealed in 1933. But for a short period of time, for about 13 years or so, alcohol was banned on a national level in the United States in the name of making society better, but it led to other issues. Another way in which progressives maybe pushed kind of the limits, both theoretically but very much in practice, was within the field of eugenics. And eugenics is, broadly speaking, a movement, intellectual movement, social movement, to control populations, but very much rooted in the idea of, certainly genetic and maybe racial superiority and inferiority. Right? So again, it's sort of eugenics is based off of the fundamental idea that, as this kind of newspaper states here, that there are simply just some people who are born better than others. This newspaper reads, "Some people are born to be a burden on the rest." And so this could have several different sort of interpretations or implementations. Kind of ideas regarding genetic superiority and inferiority. This could refer to, for example, the differences between the rich and the poor. Much of it is based into notions of racial superiority and inferiority, that there are some races of people who are better than the rest. And so if you're working off of that idea, then it makes sense for a progressive reformer then to do what they can to try and control the population. And this could be done through various means. On one end, which we do see later on in the United States, are immigration restrictions. We can think back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. If you are of the belief that the Chinese are racially inferior, which many did at the time in the United States, then one way to improve society would to prohibit immigration from that particular region or that particular area. Other ways in which you could find eugenics policies, various marriage laws. So, for example, laws prohibiting intermarriage between racial groups. On a more kind of a more active level, this could show up in the form of selective breeding. And then the most extreme form would be sterilization, right? To sterilize those that to stop them from reproducing. There were some elements of the progressive era that did, at the very least, flirt with the idea of eugenics. And in some very, very selective cases, I mean, some of the laws and policies that we do find passed in the United States are immigration restrictions. We do find marriage laws, right? Specifically outlawing marriages between blacks and whites, for example. Selective breeding was less something forced by law, but sterilization, there were some states that did have programs that sterilized, but it wasn't anything that was widespread or quite on a national level. And again, this kind of, if we get back to our earlier point, when we start talking about this type of population control, we're really starting to raise some questions about what exactly are the limits to what progressives can and can't do or should not do. Um, Another way, maybe in which the progressive movement was limited, although I don't know if I'd quite put it that way, um, are kind of keeping at bay some of the more radical notions of transforming society. Um, in a certain sense, we could say that the progressives wanted to improve society, whereas the socialists or the communists or the anarchists, they might have the same concerns about, for example, concentrated economic power. They might have the same concerns about the welfare of all citizens, but they differ in their tactics. Whereas progressives are just kind of looking to make some adjustments to society. The socialists, the communists, and the anarchists want to fundamentally change society. So you might have some overlap between socialists and progressives, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And many progressives would probably agree that the fundamental pillars of society, democracy, capitalism, those things should still stay in place. The progressives weren't looking to, abolish capitalism or abolish democracy. They were looking to make it better, make it work better. Whereas some other groups are looking to take more kind of um, further measures. So, for example, socialism, and sometimes we can use these terms interchangeably, socialism and communism, but socialism, more broadly speaking, advocates for state ownership, state or government ownership, rather than private ownership. So instead of allowing John Rockefeller to own Standard Oil ought to be owned by the state or by the government. That way, people, by exercising democratic power, can have some control over the quote unquote means of production. Socialism, communism, I mean, there was a strain of it in the United States that was popular. Eugene Debs, for example, he was the socialist candidate for president in 1912. He got 1 million votes as the socialist candidate. But socialism never really took hold in the United States like it did in other places in Europe. There was a lot of reasons for that. One reason was that typically ethnic, racial, and linguistic differences, or at least identities in the United States, took precedence over any type of class identity in the United States. Also, not all socialists agreed on the tactics or the goals. Groups like the IWW, for example, the International Workers of the World, they sought more militant tactics, whereas people like Debs and the Socialist Party of America were looking to work within the political system. So, several reasons as to why the socialists didn't thrive in the United States or succeed in the United States to the same extent that the progressives did. Although, we might say that they had some of the same goals. So the progressive movement certainly had some of its limitations, right? There were some areas in which the broad majority of the American public were not willing to go, or sometimes they went there, but those things were sort of pulled back. The prohibition of alcohol, eugenics like policies, and trying to overthrow the capitalist system. Most Americans were not kind of ready to go or willing to go that far. Um, and maybe because of that, or maybe not because of that, the progressives did have national or eventually did achieve national support. Unlike the populist movement, which failed to elect a political candidate, US presidents, three of them in particular, did become progressives, right? That the movement became popular enough that it controlled the White House. So in total, there are three progressive presidents. Now, an important thing to note as far as progressive presidents go is that it is not particular to a political party. Both the Democrats and the Republicans could be progressive, right? It wasn't a particular party issue. There were progressive Democrats, progressive Republicans. Again, to be progressive is to believe in those broad sort of set of ideas by using, science and knowledge to influence governmental policy, to help people's welfare, and to challenge monopolistic power. The first progressive president is Teddy or Theodore Roosevelt, and his ascendancy to the presidency was, as the book states, by accident. That was Roosevelt, and we're talking Teddy Roosevelt to distinguish him from the other Roosevelt that was president, was VP to another president we talked about in an earlier chapter, and that was William McKinley. William McKinley was not a progressive. Teddy Roosevelt was. But McKinley picked Roosevelt to be his vice president because the reality is that the vice president really doesn't have that much power. And this was kind of a way to control Roosevelt, who had ideas that were, again, somewhat new, at least in the progressive realm. But William McKinley was assassinated. He becomes the third president in American history to be assassinated, after Abraham Lincoln and after James Garfield. And his assassination led to Teddy Roosevelt becoming the next president of the United States. And in fact, at the time, he was the youngest president. And so now, with Theodore Roosevelt believing in these progressive ideas, he's now in the most powerful position of the federal office. And so he begins to act in very much a progressive way almost immediately. Roosevelt would eventually be known as the quote-unquote trust buster. Remember that trusts were organizations or legal entities of monopolistic economic power. And one of the earliest actions by Roosevelt as president was to target in particular, a railroad trust in the United States. Roosevelt, though, believed that there were such things as good and bad trusts. There were some trusts that were, exploited the American population, but there were also some good trusts that helped the United States nationally. And so in his entire tenure, even though Roosevelt would eventually be known as the trust buster, or at least, that's what his nickname would be, the reality is that he actually didn't break up as many trusts as his successors would, as some of the other presidents. But At the very least, by targeting trusts very early on in his presidency, he made it clear to all the other corporations around the United States to like sort of not mess with them, right? He was willing to target certain businesses and willing to go after it. Another kind of important way in which Roosevelt differed from his predecessors was the position that he took when it came to conflicts between business and labor. Again, let us recall in the Gilded Age, for the most part, almost every single time, the government sided with business, right? The government always sided with the interests of business. However, when coal miners went on strike in 1902, Roosevelt threatened to take the coal mine if an agreement wasn't made. And we might say that this was maybe one of the first times that a US president did not explicitly side with the interests of business. In fact, Roosevelt himself was threatening to use federal troops to take property away from the coal mining business. And via this threat, the miners and the business were able to reach an agreement. The miners got a 10% raise in their wages. And in essence, this was maybe the sign that, or a sign that there was a president who now had at least acknowledged some of the problems that labor or workers were going through. So Roosevelt's approach to the coal miner strike more or less outlined his broader progressive policies. He called it the square deal. Square is even on both sides. Roosevelt wanted to treat all, you might say, sides, and by sides, business and labor, equal. Roosevelt, maybe above anything else, was a nationalist, right? He wanted what was best for all Americans, and American workers were Americans. And so the idea behind the square deal is that he's not playing favorites. He's not going to favor business over the workers. He's going to try and treat everybody more equally. Amongst Roosevelt's progressive reforms also was a number of laws that offered consumer protections. Again, it wasn't just labor or workers who were being exploited by big business, but it was also consumers who were. And some of the laws that Roosevelt signed were the Pure Food and Drug Act. This was a law that restricted the sale of dangerous medicine. Really, there was no really sort of law regulating. There were no laws really sort of regulating, the types of things that businesses produced. In fact, very often they could lie about what they were selling, and consumers were more or less in a very vulnerable position. So that helped to protect consumers from the types of harmful things that businesses could produce. Another one of Roosevelt's progressive reforms was the Meat Inspection Act, which was inspired by a book called The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair, will call him a muckraker. So he is somebody who is exposing Gilded Age problems to the broader American society. And he wrote this book called The Jungle, which was a book about the exploitative meat industry. Meat industry being rather large in Chicago. What the Jungle, or what Sinclair had initially wanted to do, was actually to expose the conditions that workers were facing. But what people were more fascinated with weren't actually the workers, they were more fascinated with the meat. And that is because Sinclair described the way in which like rotten meat would be passed off as like a good product. And there were all sorts of things going on behind the scenes in terms of what was going on in those factories that were, unsanitary, that were just outright repulsive. Roosevelt himself said that he threw up after reading The Jungle. And so, inspired by that book, Congress and Roosevelt passed the Meat Inspection Act, which would provide federal inspections of the meat industry. And this would, again, further offer protection to consumers. The one thing that maybe makes Roosevelt most unique, not just from his contemporaries at the time, but really ever since, was his position on the environment. Environmentalism, as we understand it today, really wasn't a thing. There were some ideas coming out of the Gilded Age in regards to the environment. For a very long time, the idea was that, not just the environment, but nature more broadly had been somewhat of an oppressive force against just humankind. You can go back to a lot of ancient or, historical literature, and there are a lot of themes about kind of man versus nature, and nature had always had the upper hand. But thanks to Gilded Age technology, you could say that nature was now the one in the vulnerable position, and it was now possible to cut down every single tree in the United States, to blow up every mountain looking for mineral resources. And there were some people who began to kind of caution about this very rapid resource extraction that was taking place in the United States and especially in the West. And so what Roosevelt did was he added more land to the national forest and national park system to protect it from various development. So we might just say about national forests and national parks, we'll just say that Roosevelt added millions of acres. And Roosevelt subscribed to this belief of conservationism, or the conservationists. And the conservationists wanted to protect land, we might say, for intelligent development. Because of the technology of the Gilded Age, because of the laissez-faire, social Darwinistic, hands-off approach, businesses were pretty much allowed to go into the West and do whatever they want in terms of finding mineral resources or finding lumber or fishing or, whatever it was. And so Roosevelt's viewed this as being a national issue, that if these businesses were allowed to just have a free-for-all and develop the West or extract resources in the West, just to make the biggest amount of profit in the shortest amount of time, that would actually be bad for the country. And instead, land ought to be conserved, not just to protect it, for the sake of nature, but conserved for intelligent resource development. And there's actually a difference between conservation and preservation. John Muir was maybe the most famous preservationist. He helped to create the Sierra Club. And the preservationists, right? So we'll call these guys preservationists. And that would be somebody who wanted to preserve the quote-unquote natural environment. So these would be people who would advocate to never develop land to extract resources. That there was a certain environment. There was a certain kind of almost like a spirituality that was connected with the with nature, and losing it would have a significant cultural impact, spiritual impact, not just economic. And Roosevelt spent some time with John Muir. Here's a picture of them together. I believe this is in Yosemite. And he was somewhat inspired by that, or inspired by that notion. But for the most part, the broad majority of Americans, at least politicians, would consider themselves under the conservationist camp, not necessarily the preservationist camp. Other laws and policies that Roosevelt helped enact included the National Reclamation Act. This was a law to bring irrigation to the West. And, this kind of preservation conservation battle or back and forth, one of the more public kind of battles over what to do with Western lands was over Hetch Hetchy. And Hetch Hetchy was an area in the Yosemite Valley. And the big question in Hetch Hetchy was either to preserve it or build a dam. The dam would bring water to the nearby city of San Francisco, and so this was like a 10-year-long battle. Should we preserve this kind of for the natural environment that it is, or should we build a dam so that it serves people? And after a very kind of long battle, eventually voters approved to build a dam. And so in some cases, we might say that Hetch Hetchy was kind of this battleground over notions of conservation and preservation that occurred out west during the Gilded Age. Now, Roosevelt himself was a very popular president, but he did decide after what was almost 2 terms. Recall that Roosevelt assumed the presidency off of an assassination, and then following the assassination, he served 1 additional term. So he was in office maybe like 7 years or something like that. So not the full 8 years, but he decided to step away. And when he stepped away, following in the footsteps of the 2-term precedent that George Washington had set forward all the way back in the very late 1700s, he picked William Howard Taft to be his successor. So William Howard Taft was the handpicked progressive successor to Roosevelt. And here's William Taft here. Kind of a fun fact about William Taft. He's the heaviest president or the largest president that we've had in American history. But he was supposed to be like Roosevelt in pretty much every way. Roosevelt would spend the next 4 years traveling and hunting in Africa, going to Europe, kind of seeing the rest of the world. However, though, Taft had a really difficult presidency, at least in the eyes of other progressives. So much so that even Roosevelt himself would not consider Taft to be progressive enough. The main issue, or one of the main issues in which Taft was not seen as being progressive enough, was on the issue of tariffs. Recall that tariffs were seen as pro-business. And it was within tariffs that Taft was not willing to lower them. And so because Taft got kind of wrapped up in this issue of tariffs, he was not willing to make them lower or get rid of them. A lot of progressives felt betrayed that Taft wasn't really a true progressive. And one of those people who felt betrayed was Teddy Roosevelt, who decided in 1912 to run for president. Against Taft. Right? He would return to the United States, disappointed by his protege. His protege had failed to live up to the progressive ideal, and he was going to go and challenge his student, so to speak. Right? It's like the student and the teacher. However, though, in the Republican nomination process, the Republicans ultimately went with kind of the more, maybe at the time, what they considered to be the more safe and traditional pick, and that was to pick the incumbent, right? Republicans chose Taft over Roosevelt. And you might think, well, that should be the end of it. But of course, Roosevelt, being the person and personality he is, decided that after not winning the Republican nomination, that he would run as a third party. And so the Bull Moose Party, or Progressive Party, was Roosevelt's, or was a third party. We'll say was the third party see, was the third party of Roosevelt to run in the 1912 election. All right, so kind of a very dramatic series of events. You kind of have the protege not living up to the expectations, and the master, so to speak, Roosevelt, coming back and challenging his former protege. And when the Republicans choose to run Taft again, Roosevelt says, I feel like I'm as fit or as strong as a bull moose. I'll run third party. And given Roosevelt's popularity, given his past history as being a president, this would be one of the most successful third party runs in terms of just the amount of vote that Roosevelt gets. The Bull Moose Party, the Progressive Party, would never be able to exist outside of Roosevelt. In this case, the candidate was bigger than the party. And so this led to, at the very least, what is one of the more interesting presidential contests in American history, and that was the 1912 election, which we had the incumbent president, William Howard Taft, the Republican. We had Teddy Roosevelt, the president before Taft, running as a third party, the Bull Moose Party. And now we're introduced to Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was progressive, but he was also running as the Democrat. And predictably, as you might imagine, those on the Republican side split their vote between Taft and Roosevelt. I believe Roosevelt actually got more of the popular vote. In fact, we can see the election results here. Theodore Roosevelt got 27% of the vote. William Howard Taft got 23% of the vote. And so that meant that they both lost. Then Woodrow Wilson only getting 41% of the vote. That is, a majority of Americans did not vote for Woodrow Wilson, but he ended up being the winner because so many of the other parties split their vote in various ways. Now, Woodrow Wilson, in terms of his presidency, we may want to know Woodrow Wilson most for being the president when World War I broke out, but that's not covered for another chapter. While he was president, he was the third and last progressive. So in terms of our progressive presidents, they're actually all represented in the 1912 election. Roosevelt was the first progressive president, Taft was the second, and Wilson is the third. And so some of his policies or laws that he enacts include the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. The 16th Amendment would allow for a federal graduated progressive income tax. Part of this was because Wilson did get rid of tariffs when he got into office, and tariffs, in addition to protecting American businesses, were actually a considerable source of revenue for the federal government. And so if the federal government is going to do more in terms of protecting federal lands, protecting consumers from rotten meat, protecting consumers from rotten medicine, they're going to need to make up that income somewhere. And so the graduated income tax was not only kind of hearkening back to groups like the populists who wanted to do more about wealth redistribution, but was also a way for the United States to raise more money. And so since Woodrow Wilson, we had a federal income tax. He also passed the Federal Reserve Act, which created a central bank to better control the economy. During the Gilded Age, it was very much an economy of boom and bust. And so a central bank could better kind of regulate or pull the levers of the economy to make sure that we're not going through this boom and bust cycle. And lastly, new antitrust legislation that would make the Sherman Antitrust Act stronger and more effective. So we might just say about the Clayton Antitrust Act, a stronger antitrust law. And so Woodrow Wilson certainly has his progressive achievements. But once again, when we think about Wilson, we typically most closely associate him as being the president when World War I broke out.